Same old man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So simple.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 542 for July 9th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Special Agent Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Brendan, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to talk about the Mission Impossible films again.
Again? Oh, man. This podcast is going to self-destruct before we even have a chance to talk about these films.
Certainly is possible. This is going to be interesting for a couple of reasons. One, we've technically done a Mission Impossible retrospective once before. We did it on an extra film podcast years ago at this point. Was it leading up to Fallout?
I think it was leading up to Fallout. Yeah, I think it was.
So we have technically talked about all these films previously. However, that was a while ago. Our thoughts on these films might have shifted a little bit. We'll see as we get into it. Also, part of this, we are doing this last minute. Like this.
Yeah,
was
we're
not
calling
the
an
plan.
audible here. It's my fault. I'll say. Well, it's more so Mother Nature's fault.
Yeah.
It's not really my fault. It's really just my circumstance that's causing this audible that we're talking about. Because we were originally going to talk about our favorite action sequences of the 21st century. And of course, the Mission Impossible franchise is notorious for its practical stunt work. It's Tom Cruise refusing to act his age, right?
God bless him.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love him for that. So the plan was for us to record this episode and have that prep work done the next night that we're recording this right now. We're recording this on a Sunday night. The plan was to record it on Monday night. I was supposed to go to a concert tonight here in Philly. That concert got rained out. The weather here it's been terrible. It's been terrible over the past couple weeks. So the concert has now been rescheduled to tomorrow night, and I don't want to miss it. So that's
fair.
That's the reason for it. It's going to be, for a little inside baseball, JD, it's going to be a bit of a shit show, to put it bluntly, with this. So for some context, the concert I'm seeing is Erykah Badu, and she's going to be with Yazim Bey, formerly known as Mos Def. And I'm really looking forward to that. So that was supposed to be tonight. It's now rescheduled to tomorrow night. Tomorrow night also has another show at a different venue in Philly, and that's Alicia Keys.
Oh, boy.
And you would probably expect that there are a lot of audiences that were wanting to go to both. One night and then one the next night. So I have no idea what's going to happen as far as those people who want to try and get refunds somewhere else. This is going to be a wild ride. I'm not part of it, but it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out.
I am super grateful I am not part of those logistics. That does sound like a nightmare.
Yeah, I just want to go and enjoy a concert, and hopefully I get the chance to tomorrow night.
That is not a mission I would choose to accept.
That's how we're tying this. Mission Impossible. The IMF is going to be called in to fix this fiasco.
Yeah, maybe they will. We are changing gears. We had to call an audible, and so we're coming at this differently than we anticipated, but we've seen all of these films several times over. Yeah. And we felt like, you know what, if we're going to call an audible, let's just go ahead and dive into the IMF, into the world of Tom Cruise. Yeah, and let's just talk about these movies, how we feel about them, and perhaps how that lends itself to our expectations for Dead Reckoning, which is coming out later this week.
Yeah.
So I guess let's go ahead and jump into this, Brendan. Where do you want to begin? Do you want to start with overall thoughts on the franchise and kind of go from there?
Yeah, let's talk about some overall thoughts, because I think this franchise has had a bit of an interesting trajectory. Many would argue that they seem to be getting better with each installment, which is a kind of a rarity for any franchise that is now releasing its 7th installment. That's kind of insane. Now, I don't necessarily share the opinion that each film has gotten better, but I think the importance or the significance of these films have certainly increased with time. The way we talk about them, the the almost meta component of Tom Cruise refusing to act his age, like we say. The fact that they are really embracing practicality, stunt work, real dangerous situations that they're trying to capture on film. They've become synonymous with the Mission Impossible films, but it wasn't always that way, right? You know, I feel like when it started, it was something else, and then it sort of morphed into that, so it made them more interesting. So I think that's what makes the franchise so interesting. And I'll just say this. I don't think there's a bad film in the bunch. There are some I like more than others. There are some that I don't necessarily love, but I at the very least, all 6 of these movies thus far. Yeah. And that's pretty incredible for a franchise like this.
I agree. I have loved this franchise. I think they're all very good to some degree or another. You know, even, the film that I am least on here, I very much do like in some ways. And I think what's interesting about this franchise, and we can talk about the stunt work and the action of it. And it is interesting how this set to precedent before something like the Fast and Furious franchise and how absurd they got. Tom Cruise was upping the ante before all of that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the progression of that. When you talk about stunt work over the last 15, 20 years, I do think the conversation very much begins with Tom Cruise and what he's been able to do. I mean, like, another franchise we all love is John Wick. Tom Cruise was doing it before John Wick. So, a lot of it certainly begins with the Fast and Furious, with the Mission Impossible franchise and Tom Cruise. And we certainly do love that. I think what's also interesting about MI, from my perspective, is how I come at this in terms of Ethan as a character. I am going to say some things on this episode that a lot of people will disagree with.
I'm raising my hand here. Because, JD, I want to call attention to that. You and I tend to have the same brain on a lot of things, but we actually do disagree a little bit with regard to the Mission Impossible franchise, at least which films we prefer over others. Your ranking is very different than my ranking.
Yeah, and look, all I ask for, while you may disagree, I just simply ask for people listening, watching out there to just kind of bear with me as I walk through it. Because I will come at it passionately. I will come at it with facts. I will come at it with evidence.
With facts.
Okay? And so
he's going on an impossible mission here, I think.
That's the mission I'm choosing to accept.
But even so, I don't think you're going to get much pushback on this, because it's been a bit of a popular trend right now on film Twitter, at least, to tweet your rankings of the Mission Impossible franchise. And it's pretty awesome that I feel like there's not really a consensus pick. I feel like there are films that people like more than others, more so. But there's not that one film that I think everyone goes to saying, "Oh, this is universally the best one of the 6, at least thus far." It kind of wavers a little bit, which I think is really fascinating. So you might not get all that much pushback based on your very unique perspective with what you come at here.
I sort of agree with that, and also disagree. I do think there is a consensus number 1. I do think that.
I mean, from a critic aggregation standpoint, maybe. But I'll say this: when I saw a lot of those rankings on film Twitter, I didn't always see that film at number 1.
Okay, there's a film that if it's not number 1, it's probably 2. Worst case, it's 3. And I would say that's the only film where that is the case. Now, when I get into my favorites of the franchise, yes, I know that I'm not alone in it. And that's great. Honestly, a few weeks ago, I felt much more isolated and on an island. And since people have been tweeting out their thoughts on Mission Impossible, it's been really fun to see that people do agree with that. And I think it's because when we're watching these characters on screen, there is an element of fun to be had, and we love the practicality of it. We love the stunt work of it. As we noted, the industry owes a lot to Tom Cruise and what he's willing to do. However, I do think it says something about how you cannot divorce a film from character and emotion.
Sure.
As much as the visuals are a significant element of it, you can't divorce critical thinking and art, and specifically with film, you can't divorce imagery from that. I think on the same token, when it comes to a film's themes, but even more importantly, emotion and character, being drawn into the character. Like, I do not care how good it looks. I don't care how well crafted it is. If I am completely and utterly disengaged from the character and from the film's emotional core, it's a bland experience. And that goes across all genres, all types of movies, right? And and you know, depending on the filmmaker and the movie, you know, there's fluctuations and all of that. Like with someone like Andrei Tarkovsky, for example, like his characters aren't always the most graceful and the most elegant, and you're going to love them. But that's also not the purpose of what he's trying to do as a filmmaker. I
just want to see Tarkovsky direct the Mission Impossible movie if he came back from the grave.
It would be very different. That is for sure. So look, I get it. And I say that as a fan of Tarkovsky. I love Andrei Tarkovsky. So it's not, you know, there's variances of gray as there is with most things. So I say that to say, broadly speaking, but especially in genre film and with these kind of movies, if we did not care about Ethan, if Tom Cruise wasn't charming and a presence on screen, right, with the craft, with the stunt work as it is, would this franchise be as successful? I would say absolutely it would not be.
Probably not. Yeah, like we drift away from that. And thankfully this franchise has it, but it's interesting that I feel like each film has its own kind of ethos in supporting that idea, which is what I think is so fascinating about the Mission Impossible franchise. While there is continuity here, it's not reliant on that continuity. Like there are some films that have their own their own emotional backbone, their own themes, their own ideas on their respective minds, and it almost makes the film very continuous. It makes sense, but it almost feels kind of episodic at the same time too, which I love that about it. It has all of these things maneuvering together, and I think it's really smartly done. Well,
and also I want to be clear about that, because you make a great point that continuity doesn't have to be utterly seamless. And I'm not talking about continuity. Sure. That is different. You know, going to a very different franchise that, you know, again, it's not apples to apples. But one thing I loved about Fox's X-Men franchise is that they didn't give two rats' ass about continuity. You know what I mean? And from film to film, there was something to appreciate. Like I really like X-Men 2. I still think that's good. Or even that first one I think is quite good.
I'll go to bat for X-Men 3. I'll just say that. I kind of like that movie.
and again, you can just talk about the continuity of just those three, but then you get into, you know, the newer films as well. And Days of Future Past, you know, there's connective tissue to them all, but it's not what the MCU is trying to do, for example. It is way more disjointed. Oftentimes, there are these huge missing gaps, but Fox didn't care. They didn't care about those gaps. They weren't trying to be the MCU, and I kind of appreciate that they were doing their own thing. So, like, when it comes to continuity, it mostly depends on intent. You know, like Marvel has made it very clear that continuity is significant to them. So when there's missing gaps there, you know, there's maybe a little bit more room to criticize. But I think they've done a good job of bringing at least a broad continuity to everything that they're trying to do there. I agree. With Mission Impossible, the continuity is less important to me as much as it is how far are we going into Ethan as a character? That to me is where I think the conversation really lies, because the continuity from, let's say, 1 to 2 to 3 Is that uneven in terms of continuity? Absolutely. And then from 3 to 4 to 5, there's even more of a disparity in terms of continuity. That is not my problem. My issue with the franchise is how are we using the depths of Ethan as a human? Like, are we doing this or are we not doing it? Like, that to me is kind of my bigger issue if we're looking at Mission Impossible on the whole. The episodic feel of it, I do appreciate and I do like. But if we're going to delve into Ethan as a character, you know, what is the intent of all of this? That to me is unclear at times.
And that's fair. And I think that's something I do appreciate about the franchise is that each film, despite, you know, Ethan's growth as a character, sometimes making sense between installments, each installment kind of has its own thematic identity at times. I mean, you've got some movies here that actually very directly in a meta way kind of address that Ethan Hunt might be might be literally insane, his aerobatic insanity, as they sometimes talk about, which could be very different from the emotional depths that we see in something like Mission Impossible Fallout, for instance. But you can still trace it back to some of those things. It's not as literal as, let's say, like a journey like Harry Potter through 7 or 8 films, right? It's not that kind of growth. But I like that there is an identity that each film has aesthetically, tonally, thematically, but you could still find ways to thread that needle back to other films. And it allows us as an audience to kind of do that work sometimes. Yeah. So some people might find that convoluted, but I think there's a tricky wire work attempt here to really pull these movies together that most franchises don't do. Like it's really asking us to think about what's threading that needle, and it's really interesting. It's an impossible mission. It really is at times, but I like that.
Well, let's dig into this a little bit more specifically. I know we've been talking broadly about Ethan and Mission Impossible, but I do want to talk a little bit more specifically, and certainly listeners of the show will know where we're going with this, because I guess let's just start at Mission Impossible 3. That first Mission Impossible, I think, is really great as an action spy thriller. It's fantastic, and we can certainly get to that. But since we're talking about Ethan and his progression, I do want to talk about 3, because the first 2, as much as I enjoy them, especially that first one, what we know about Ethan is very little. He's a great character, and Tom Cruise brings a lot to Ethan with his performance, I would say. But everything is self-contained within the plotting of those films. We don't know much about him outside of, you know, IMF and who Ethan is in that regard, which, you know, I'm not necessarily against, because it's the first 2 times that we're with him.
And even if you want to watch it on its own terms, he's still a compelling character to watch. That by the time the end credits roll for, let's say, that first film, I still feel like I experienced a complete film and a complete journey that I'm happy with.
Which is what I love about Mission Impossible 3, because it feels like the right time to go beyond the IMF. Let's get to know Ethan as a character, more specifically and more importantly, as a human being. This is the first time in this franchise where we get necessary character development, and it humanizes him finally.
Oh, yeah.
And we see him at his most vulnerable, maybe really of the entire franchise, given everything that we saw post Mission Impossible 3. Although Fallout gets back to it a little bit. But this is the first time. Mission Impossible 3 is the first time we get to see Ethan the human. Ethan, the guy that has relationships outside of the IMF. The guy that wants to have a life, that just doesn't have a job. And I think it does it brilliantly. I genuinely, without irony, love the screenplay to Mission Impossible 3. Because of how it connects the dots with Ethan's desire for normalcy, his desire for Julia, and wanting something beyond, you know, what he does with the IMF. And it actually starts with not just that opening segment there, which I think is a stunner.
That flash forward that we're talking about. Oh my gosh,
that moment is great. As far as opening scenes of any of these films, it is by far my favorite. It is really great.
Okay.
But even beyond that, the opening action sequence when they're tasked with getting one of their fallen soldiers.
Yeah, Kerry Russell, right?
Kerry Russell, yes. I love, and I guess, spoiler here, for Mission Impossible 3, I guess. But I love that they fail that sequence, that they don't succeed in it. The failure of that mission only heightens his desires in that film, especially for Julia. It's not only a subversive way to end that sequence because, let's be honest, IMF, they know what they're doing. They're very good at their jobs, and they don't fail often. So I do love that the film is a little subversive in that regard. But more importantly, it taps into that emotional core because once they fail, he immediately starts thinking about Julia in a heightened way, in a new way. All of a sudden, the stakes are much higher for him. So I do love that even after that opening, that first action sequence taps into that more. We get that, that scene with him at home and with the party and all of that as well. So that early conversation right before they get married, like there's a pathos to that as well.
Yeah.
So like in terms of the writing and the humanizing of Ethan, I think is great, but also just in terms of the IMF, like his interactions with his team, and this is the first time that we're introduced to Simon Pegg's character here. Like all of that is quite fantastic. Like I love the moment when Ving Rhames is like, and forgive me, I'm blanking on Kerry Russell's character's name, but he's like, did you sleep with her? And
yeah,
like,
was there
no.
more? Was there more there between you two? Yeah.
And he's like, no, she was my sister.
Well, see, like,
and he's like,
that's one thing I do like about this franchise, and not every film gets into it, but there's always this like unspoken vibe that there actually is genuine friendship between some of these characters.
The camaraderie is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the camaraderie is not great in every movie, or at least it's certainly better in others than some other examples. But in moments like that between Tom Cruise and Ving Rhames, and especially Simon Pegg, there's a reason why Simon Pegg came back as a major player, even though he only has a bit part in this movie.
Yes, it's small, but he comes back.
Yeah, but
in a
he
big
makes
way.
an impression. He really does. But you sense genuine friendship between them, and that even becomes literal in something like Rogue Nation, for instance.
Yeah, and
that's actually spoken by Simon Pegg's Benji, that I am your friend and I'm joining you on this mission.
Yes.
And you feel that. You genuinely believe that.
Absolutely. I do love the progression of Benji here, and again, the dynamic, the writing behind all of that in 3, I think is great. Or that first scene we get with Lawrence Fishburne, the writing there is excellent. And Fishburne is so good at delivering that dialogue and how it's so snappy and crisp. Like I love the sharpness of that. It's really biting, and Fishburne comes off quite wonderful. So like the writing of the film, say what you will about JJ's direction. And look, I get it. People don't always love it. I do think part of the filmmaking here is a product of its time. So I'm certainly willing to accept it. And I'm also generally not as dismissive of JJ's direction as so many others are. I think this is far from bad.
It's not bad.
I do agree that it's not what Christopher McQuarrie brings to this, or even a Brad Bird from a filmmaking perspective. I'm willing to concede there, but I don't think it's terrible either. And what he does do is he lets that writing come through in these vivid ways with these early scenes I'm talking about. But of course, as Ethan delves into his fear and his motives and ultimately his catharsis, and then there's all of the writing between Tom Cruise and Philip Seymour Hoffman as well, which I think is excellent as well. Going back to the opening scene that we get and when Philip Seymour Hoffman comes back. So like in terms of the emotional core of this film, I do find it fundamentally human in a way that no other film in this franchise has really been able to tap into. It comes at the right time, and I think it's done beautifully. I love that he is driven by something more than just saving the world yet again, which of course is, again, that's part of these movies. I do get it, but in this case, there's something more beyond that. It is less defeating the antagonist and quote unquote saving the world, and it is more about the relationships he fosters in this film and the people around him,
right?
What he's trying to save. That the groundedness of that, I think, is excellent here. And my last thought, and then I'll let you kind of jump in here. I love that the mystery behind this is nothing but a MacGuffin. The rabbit's foot is never explained, and it never
I love that
really
about
matters.
it.
I love the self-awareness
that
of that
proves your point there. Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely loved it, and the subversiveness and all of that I think is really quite great. So Mission Impossible 3 to me is very refreshing comparatively to the others. The writing is genuinely fantastic. It is really great, and I don't think it gets enough credit for that. And it is Tom Cruise gives the best performance in this film of his performances in these movies, and to me, it's not
from
even
a dramatic performance for sure. I would definitely agree with you. And I guess to let the cat out of the bag a little bit, this is a film you like more than I do. I know that this is when you have. This is your favorite Mission Impossible film, I think you were alluding to there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
This is towards the bottom for me, but it's still a film I really do like, and I guess really our biggest disparity is, I guess I'm a little bit more bothered by the J.J. Abrams directional choices here being a product of its time. Something I look for in a Mission Impossible film is something aesthetically that's going to wow me, and this film doesn't really have that. I think when it's functioning as an Ethan Hunt movie, it's really good, and it's everything that you're talking about there. So there's a lot that we don't really disagree on. It's just some of the aspects of it functioning as a Mission Impossible film simultaneously I don't love as much as maybe you do in that way. I don't really love a lot of the team dynamics here. I don't really like Jonathan Rhys-Meyers in the film. Maggie Q, I think, is really underutilized as well.
Yeah, we'll very much disagree. I loved both of them here as supporting.
I think they're very forgettable. I don't love them that much here, and I think it's not really their fault. I think it's really more of the film kind of I think the film and the story it's telling maybe drowning them a little bit, given the pathos of Ethan Hunt and the story it's trying to tell as a tale of normalcy for this world-saving agent, right? Which I think is a great idea, and that does take precedent. And, to be fair, it should take precedent. It's something that this franchise definitely needed to be a movie that was about breaking away from the grandness and the impossibleness of this franchise into something more emotionally practical. We talk a lot about the practicality of the stunt work in these movies, but this is one that's trying to use practicality in a very different way, which I do appreciate.
And I love that it's smaller in that regard.
I do too. Yeah, it's a movie I think I love the idea more than I actually do the execution. I think it's really just that balance between it being an Ethan Hunt movie and a Mission Impossible movie that I don't always love, because the stuff I love about it being an Ethan Hunt movie is amazing. I love his relationship with Julia, Michelle Monaghan here. I think their chemistry is amazing.
They're so good.
It really is, and it's genuinely romantic. To say that this movie functions best as an action romance, I would not really push back on that notion. That's something I really do appreciate about the film. It's really just some of the J.J. Abrams directional choices I don't always love, and it's something I guess bothers me a little bit more than it bothers you.
Well, and that's interesting, and it's why I wanted to emphasize as we somewhat move on with this conversation, why I wanted to emphasize at the beginning of this that you can't divorce film from its aesthetics. It's important. Yeah. You also can't divorce it from character and emotion. That is equally important. To me, anyway. I would argue that you cannot divorce that, because where JJ might lack with his aesthetics are comparatively to others, I think the film more than makes up for that in emotion and character, where the others, it's the opposite. With Brad Bird and McQuarrie, their aesthetics, the stunt work in Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation, undeniable, especially comparatively to a lot of, not just in this series, but a lot of other action blockbuster thrillers that are aiming for the same goals. Aesthetically, those films are the gold standard, and I don't disagree with that. But from a character perspective and emotion perspective, I feel about those films the way you do about Abrams and his filmmaking.
I don't know. I think Rogue Nation's a nice bridge between all of those things. Maybe not as emotionally heft and thick as Mission Impossible 3 is, but I think the synergy between all of those elements is better in Rogue Nation.
I don't think Rogue Nation gives one iota about.
Oh,
Ethan
I want
as
to
a
punch
human.
you in the face so hard right
Doesn't
now.
care.
I think that movie has
it
great
does
character
not
notions
care.
on friend. Oh, it absolutely does. Come on, JD.
It does not care.
It
No,
does.
it does not. Does not.
It's a simple notion about friendship. I mean, it's a very simple notion, but that is so heavily felt in that movie. The best scene in that movie is the defusing of the bomb that Benji has strapped him because of those emotional moments of friendship there, which I think are almost just as powerful as anything in Mission Impossible 3.
Okay. I mean, okay. I guess to be fair, like there are moments, because I don't want to talk in extremism. Let's get that out of the way. Extremism is not something that I really go for, unless it's warranted.
Neither do I. That was a rarity for both of us, I feel like.
Yeah, because there are very good moments in Rogue Nation. And also, let me be clear, I really like Rogue Nation. On the whole, I think it is a very good movie, which is why, again, I want to be careful about some of the words that I'm using to articulate this, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. The filmmaking, I think, is great. It is probably the best crafted movie of all of them. Mm-hmm. From an emotional perspective, it's just not there for me. Now, what I like about Ghost Protocol, and see, this is where we get into all like levels of gray. Yeah. Because I think from a plotting perspective, Ghost Protocol is maybe the most mundane for me. It is the most
pacing
emotionally hollow.
I think it ends. I think it ends in a very touching way. I think the final scene of Ghost Protocol is great. One of my favorite ending sequences of the entire franchise, but overall, I don't necessarily disagree. I think with Ghost Protocol, there is an attempt to humanize, let's say, Paula Patton's character and her quest for vengeance, but there's something about the narrative propulsion of that and the way that all of these arcs are interwoven that I don't think it quite gets there. Ghost Protocol is a film I still really like, but it's a film that's really built on its literal centerpiece, right? Yeah. And it's not even just the centerpiece of the film. It's kind of the centerpiece of the whole franchise, right? In many ways, it's the literal midpoint, but it is that point where I feel like the franchise started to transition into something new. But how do you work a full movie's narrative around a midpoint sequence like that? Because afterwards you have nowhere to go but down, and the film kind of does that until it makes up for a pretty touching finale. But it's a very inconsistent ride. It
is uneven for me, and it is probably the most hollow of them, aside from maybe the second film, which on the whole is one I do like as well. But emotionally very stale. But however, and why I wanted to mention again levels of gray, because there are a few moments in that film where it does remember Ethan the human. Yeah. And it does recall some of what makes Ethan great as a character, not just a person who's great at his job, which we see in spades in Ghost Protocol. Oh, my goodness, do we see that? However, Ethan, the person, I do think gets lost, but there are moments where the film reminds us of what he's fighting for and how tricky that is for him. It's not enough to make up for everything else around it, but I do appreciate those little moments in Ghost Protocol. Rogue Nation, to me, the emotion just isn't there. I just don't feel it. Like the camaraderie I feel, and those ideas of friendship, I do not deny. But Ethan as a character, as someone that I feel like is humanized in the ways that we see in 3, I just feel like is in another galaxy, and to me it just isn't effective.
I don't know if I'd say that, but I feel like it's just a film that's tapping into something different thematically, and it's something I've always found really fascinating. I feel like it's the most meta of the franchise, like trying to deconstruct even Tom Cruise's obsession with these intense stunts that he puts himself in. What does Alec Baldwin say at one point? That he is the manifestation of destiny or something like that. Like there's a quirky cleverness to the film that I've always admired, that it's tapping into something a little bit different. So it's not really a film I'd necessarily say is going for that same level of emotion. it reminds me more of what old-fashioned film noir films were essentially doing. I think the prime example is Hitchcock that a lot of people cite, but I'm also thinking of a film like Charade, with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn, the Stanley Donen film. Sure. Like that's a clear blueprint for what Rogue Nation is doing. And it's really more about banter and camaraderie and finding new themes in the mix rather than just the emotion. And I will say, despite the friendship that exists between Ethan Hunt and Benji and even Luther, I do love Ethan's dynamic with Ilsa Faust. It's a very different kind of dynamic, and those notions on trust and vengeance, I think, are very simple, but I feel something new that the franchise was going for thematically there, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, there's something provocative about it that I can't determine if I love or hate, or it might be a little bit of both.
I love. I'll just say that, but that I get you. I get you on that.
Like, and I think part of it is because there is no wrestling with Ethan's other side of him. Like it's about the camaraderie.
In some ways, it's
and
about
that friendship,
the ego,
except for that specific relationship. Now we're going for something completely different. However, we're not getting the other side of that coin, which the last two movies did go into. So that to me is where continuity becomes a little bit gray. I'm not asking for Ghost Protocol or Rogue Nation to be sequels to Mission Impossible 3. However, I am asking that you don't just pretend that didn't happen. And that to me is where there are shades of gray here. And I think Ghost Protocol somewhat does it well. It's uneven, but I at least appreciate that there's an awareness to it where Rogue Nation pretends it doesn't exist.
Well,
and so now we're going in a completely different direction with Ethan. So now it's like, well, what are we doing here with Ethan as a character? And to me, there's ambiguity there that Fallout does fix for me. Without Fallout, I think I'm much lesser on Rogue Nation. Fallout, though, because of the reveals in that film, Rogue Nation all of a sudden is a much better movie for me. Like those ambiguities are less ambiguous in a good way for me.
Well, we eventually needed a film in this franchise that I think would sort of address the kind of the ego of Ethan Hunt and the obsessive qualities of him and how that almost ties into Tom Cruise himself in a meta way. And I feel like Rogue Nation more or less is the start of those ideas, and I just find those fascinating, which is why I respond to that film so much. Rogue Nation is my favorite of these films.
Shocking.
I didn't say that yet, but I'll just make that clear in case someone else didn't notice that.
We were talking earlier about how there's a consensus favorite. I've seen that in everyone's top 2. Worst case, top 3. But everyone loves that movie. So that, like, when we're talking about Rogue Nation, that's why to me this whole conversation is a little funny to me because the more we do in session film, the more I start to realize and become aware that I am an outlier in most things, and I am starting to embrace that weirdness. So
please do, you should.
And this is one of those things where I kind of love that I'm coming from the other side of the coin. Now I'm not praising my weirdness. I'm not going down some sort of egotistical thing here.
No, but you're standing your ground as you should do.
Yes, and that's honestly all this comes down to is I love Mission Impossible 3 because it is so different from every other film in this franchise. It's smaller and its emotional stakes are at a degree that no other film in this franchise has even cared to attempt. Yeah. And
maybe Fallout does as well in its own way.
Fallout sort of gets there in the end.
Yeah.
But it's not about that throughout a lot of that movie, which is fine. I love Fallout. To me, it's still one of the best movies in this franchise. And I love Rogue Nation if I'm looking at it episodically in terms of its craft, the characters, everything about it, I think is wonderful. However, if I am looking at it more broadly, it is emotionally one of the most vapid for me. And to me, it comes down to that gray area of, again, let me reiterate, until Fallout came. But on its own terms, it's a movie that had ambiguities that to me seemed counterintuitive to the progression of Ethan, or at least it it raised questions that I wasn't sure what the answers were going to be in terms of, again, where are we going with Ethan? Are we going to care about him as a human, or are we just going to care about him as an IMF agent? If that's all it's going to be, then fine, let's make that clear. But that would have only heightened 3 for me all the more. Now, thankfully, Fallout did answer a lot of those questions. And so now there's much more of a seamlessness to the franchise for me. But at the time, that's how I felt. And so it's interesting to see how my evolution of this franchise has been distinctly different from most others. Because Rogue Nation is a film that I would say is easily, if it's not everyone's favorite, it's probably the number 2. And I get it. I understand why.
I feel like, I mean, if we are going to estimate what a consensus pick is, my guess would have been Fallout. Mostly just given the extremities of that movie. And I think from a stunt standpoint, from an action film standpoint, I don't know how any movie in the action genre is going to top Fallout in the next 20 years, unless George Miller comes out with another Mad Max movie. But there is an emotional heft to Fallout that I don't disagree does recontextualize a few things that Rogue Nation introduced. Now, I still loved Rogue Nation on its own terms, and I could still love that movie in a vacuum, and I like what that movie's doing in a vacuum, but Fallout does add a few enhancements that at least give it a sense of trajectory, right? I don't necessarily love every choice that Fallout makes in order to get to that trajectory, but I like the trajectory it's at least going for, broadly speaking. And it certainly does, it does add a sense of consistency for this franchise with regard to Ethan Hunt as a person.
Brandon, let's talk about Transformers. Yeah.
I think you also mean Beast Wars
Beast
as well.
Wars. Yeah, love me.
Tap into that nostalgia brain right there.
Yeah, love me some Transformers. We saw and talked about Transformers Rise of the Beast when it first came out a month ago or so, and I liked it. I thought it was a lot of fun.
And you're the Transformers junkie, so if anyone's going to dislike it, who's going to be hard to please, it's you. So if you liked it, that means it's perhaps doing something right from a fan base standpoint.
Look, I think it does a really good job. I've noted this a couple of times when we did the review here on the show. I mentioned this in my video review as well, but Michael Bay, they hired him because he knows how to blow crap up, right?
Yeah.
And he did a great job at that. They did not hire him to show reverence to Transformers, and he didn't. I don't even know if he knows what a Transformers is still.
Well, he probably doesn't like it if he does know what it is.
On the other hand, Stephen Cable Jr., I don't know his connection to Transformers lore, but Rise of the Beast does show reverence to the history of Transformers. That, I think, comes through wonderfully in the film. I really enjoyed it a lot. I don't necessarily care for the CGI soup of it all, but I think it's a fun movie, a fun Transformers-y movie. Sure. There's a couple of nods to Steve Jablonsky that got me going. Love that as well.
And it's not too surprising to see that reverence on screen there, because we sensed that when Stephen Cable Jr. directed Creed 2, right?
Yeah.
A reverence for that respective franchise, which I think is I think that's an underrated film in that franchise. So
I agree.
Yeah.
And the same sincerity that he showed in Creed 2 is very much on display in Rise of the Beast as well. I really liked it a lot. Genuinely, I had a lot of fun with it. And we have 5 digital codes to give away of the film.
That's true.
Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, all of the above.
Yeah.
Hit us up, and we will have some information on how you can receive one of these digital codes for the film.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be interesting with this franchise because they reveal something at the end of it. I don't know if you know what it is, Brendan. You haven't seen it yet, right?
I have not seen it yet, but I'm actually looking forward to it simply because Stephen Cable Jr. is the director.
Yeah, no, it's him and Anthony Ramos. It's worth watching for them.
Okay,
I think they're very good. Of course, Peter Cullen, just a legend.
Oh, I mean, that's Peter Cullen. What are you gonna say bad about him? Nothing.
Nothing. I will also say this: Pete Davidson, who I'm a little hit or miss on. I'm sure a lot of people are. A lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
I think he is electric as Mirage. He's a lot of fun.
How about that?
He's fun.
How about that?
Okay. He's really good. You know, it's interesting because his character of his character of Mirage is like a bumblebee transplant of sorts for reasons that are necessary. I won't give that away for plot reasons, but Mirage is really the only character aside from Bumblebee that has this much interaction with a human character.
Okay.
And so, Pete Davidson isn't like just a supporting character, like way on the side, like an Ironhide, if you will, in the Bay films. Like he's a big part of this movie, and I think he does a really good job. So at any rate, all of that to say, you got to check out this movie, and we have some digital codes to give away. So again, follow us on social media, and we will have some instructions on how you can win a digital copy for Transformers Rise of the Beast. The InSession Film Podcast is brought to you by our great friends over at First Time Watchers. Brendan, right now we are in the middle of talking about the Mission Impossible franchise, and just like Mission Impossible, this is a podcast where you want to accept the mission in front of you and listen to the show.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, I was about to say, it's your mission that you're obligated to accept is to listen to these guys, because if you love movies, this is a podcast you need to have on your radar. Hosted by Tim, Walter, and Hermano. They may not be members of the IMF, but they have what some people might say is an impossibly high knowledge of movies. I would say they do, at least.
They do indeed. On their latest episode, episode 497, they talked about a movie. And I do love this, Brennan, because I am not familiar with this film, but in their promotion for it, they put the pronunciation for the title of the movie right there,
respect
which
that
is
for
perfect.
them. Yeah.
It's great for me, where it's pronounced Ennie's Maine. It's not spelled that way, but that is how it's pronounced, apparently.
Yeah, you might think it's pronounced like Ennis Men or something like that. But this is a film I have heard of, and I've heard some pretty decent things about it, and they did have a great conversation about it.
Absolutely. I mean, based off the conversation, it's definitely one I want to go and check out. But it was a really fun show. Definitely one you got to go and check out.
Absolutely, and it's a really unique show because they pick out movies that they've never seen before. That's kind of their MO in many ways, whether it's new or old or just really obscure. They're very known for their obscure picks, and we might allude to that in just a few moments about what they're going to do on the next episode, which we may or may not be a part of. But they're rounding out their tenure as podcasters soon, closing things out on episode 500. This is 497. They're getting very close to the end, which is really sad to see. But until then, their catalog includes a lot of great movie episodes like this one. And on these shows, they even discuss some other movies that they've caught up with, and maybe some new movie trailers that are worth noting as well.
Yeah, they give out some great recommendations at the end of their show that I urge you to go and check out. And overall, the show is very smart. It's fun. As Brendan noted, it's ending soon, and this next week is going to be a wild one.
I have a bone to pick with them for this one. I really do.
I still can't believe it's happening.
I can. I know you suggested this film as a joke, but of course they were going to take us up on that when we knew that they were when they knew that we were suggesting it as a joke.
Yeah, you'll absolutely want to stay tuned for FTW this week. So with that said, Brendan, where can you find them on the internet?
You can check them out at firsttimewatchers.podbean.com. That's first spelled out FIRST, timewatchers.podbean.com. You can also hit them up on Twitter at First Time Watchers and on Facebook by simply searching First Time Watchers. Also on Instagram, First Time Watchers is where you can find them there.
Yeah, and go subscribe to them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Let them know how much you love and adore their show. Leave them a review. At the end of your review, we ask that you leave a lot of hashtags so they know we sent it to them. And this week, let's go with the hashtag I choose to accept.
I was gonna say bone to pick with Tim, but
or you could do hashtag Cars 3.
Oh, well, there's the reveal. But anyway, yeah. Oh, Tim, I love you, but sometimes you frustrate me, man.
I can't wait. It's going to be great. Anyway, go check them out. We promise you'll love them. Again, that's First Time Watchers. I do love Fallout. To me, that is probably my number 2. Now, here's the fun irony, is that Rogue Nation might be my number 3 still. Like,
given that whole conversation.
Yeah, but I will say this, and we haven't really talked about it, but that first film is quite great, so that might be my number 3 as well. Like,
that's my number 2.
That movie.
Yeah.
I love De Palma's movie.
Yeah,
so
my number 1.
Yeah.
My number 1's Rogue Nation. My number 2 is the first film. And I guess this probably just gets more into what I respond to with regard to these movies, because ironically, I'm picking the 2 that are the most old-fashioned, the most Hitchcockian, I guess. So that might not be a coincidence, but I find those films really interesting in that regard. But yeah, Fallout's probably my number 3, just given the extreme measures that film goes through, and where it does crystallize is not only poignant but kind of torturous at times. Like it's the one film in this franchise that's it's as much as I like it, Fallout's the one I rewatched the least of them all, because it's actually a pretty anxiety-filled thrill ride. I get anxiety watching that movie. It reminds me more of procedural war thrillers like Zero Dark 30 or The Hurt Locker or something like that. Like, it has a real visceral quality, a rawness to it that I can't always go back to. But I love it for that. I just don't rewatch it as much. And even when it crystallizes, there's an emotional heft to it that is kind of real and kind of dangerous, which I do like.
Yeah, I really love De Palma's film as well. It's really sharp. It's, like the tension of it is thick. It's really well crafted. And distinctly its own, because De Palma has a style that is so very different from every other director that's been in this franchise. And I do love it. Like like thinking off the cuff here, it might be my number 3. And, again, to reiterate, I do really like Rogue Nation in a vacuum on its own terms. Those ideas of friendship that you're talking about there, I don't dislike any of that stuff. It's all very good. Yeah. The provocative elements between Ethan and
Ilsa Faust.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Like, on its own terms, I do love what it's trying to provoke, but in the context of Ethan's overall progression, to me, it's like, okay, where is this going? And to me, I think that's what I do love about Fallout so much, is that a lot of that film, like the first half of that film, kind of functions in its own vacuum. It really is disconnected from most things. And then there is a reveal that's brought up where the emotion of Ethan all of a sudden is forced to the surface. And as a result, everyone is brought into Ethan's, passionate motives, where he is going outside the plan and he's taking everyone with him and they're forced along. I know we talked about this a lot when we reviewed Fallout here on the show, and I think about it all the time. And it was one of the things I was really looking forward to the most when I rewatched it a few weeks ago. But that moment that Ving Rhames has when he's articulating the relationship between Julia and Ethan. Yeah. Like there is a surprising pathos there that I did not anticipate.
I agree.
Rhames is so good and in that moment and how he's bringing that about. And I love that, I think what I really like about that moment is that he's tapping into the emotion of Ethan and Julia, and that's really the first time we had seen that come through outside of those two characters. And you think about the irony going back to Mission Impossible 3, because the first time that when Ethan's like, I'm going to marry this woman, and Ving Rhames the whole time is questioning, like, who is this woman? Why do you want to do this? This isn't a good idea.
Well,
like
I think
the whole film is like talking him out of it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things Fallout does really well with regard to bringing Julia back into the fold. Is the fact that she also knew some of these people outside of just Ethan, right? Like there actually was a genuine camaraderie between Julia and Luther, and they actually share a moment together, that diffusing of the bomb sequence towards the end, where there's actually like a genuine friendship between them too. And I think it's utilized very well. And you're right. Ving Rhames he's kind of the unsung hero in a lot of these movies
so good.
In many ways.
Yes. Yeah. He's great. I love how much fun he is. And he brings a connective tissue that I think is really great. Like Luther is always a fun character here. Same with Benji as well. The direction of this franchise on the whole, I've really liked. I think it's why I'm really looking forward to Dead Reckoning. Like, how is it going to manifest what we saw at the end of Fallout? Like, where is that going to go? There's certainly some questions to be had. And honestly, I haven't looked too much into it. Like, I don't know what the plot synopsis is. All I know is from what I see in that first teaser trailer that they showed. Because that's all that I've seen. And of course, the jump. They talk about the jump.
They talk about the jump. Yeah.
So that's all that I know. So a lot of my anticipation for the film comes off the heels of literally everything we've just talked about with this franchise.
It's interesting that we talked a little bit about already the way that Fallout addresses certain things that maybe recontextualize a few things in Rogue Nation. At least it certainly did for you in a lot of ways. There's a few things that I'm hoping / expecting to see in Dead Reckoning Part 1 that might recontextualize a few things for me with regard to Fallout. Because really right now, my biggest issue with Fallout, and it sort of involves the bringing back of Julia for a brief moment, because I think it really does work in the context of that film, not just in a vacuum, but what it means for Ethan as a character. I think my biggest problem with that is not really with Julia or even Michelle Monaghan's performance or anything like that. And maybe you disagree with me on this. Maybe most people disagree with me on this. It kind of feels like it's a way to pass the romantic torch to Ilsa Faust. And I don't feel any romantic chemistry between those two characters. I feel between Ethan and Ilsa, it's more of a camaraderie extension of what already exists with the team. I've always sensed a friendship between them. But the way that they sort of gently caress each other at the end of Fallout, I'll admit, I thought it was kind of awkward. And I'm kind of curious to see what Dead Reckoning does to maybe make me believe in something more happening there. I'm not saying I think it will or even if I think it won't, but I'm curious to see if it's going to address those things. Because right now, at least, I don't think I'm quite at the same point that the franchise wants me to be at there.
Now that is interesting because earlier we were talking about the provocative nature of Rogue Nation.
Yeah.
And to me, that almost is exclusively Ethan and Ilsa. So I guess we come at that from very different angles.
Yeah, and I think the film Rogue Nation is maybe trying to raise that as a question, but it never goes there in a literal sense. And I think by the time Fallout comes around, I never sense the sexual tension between them in that way.
And Fallout.
No, yeah, I never sensed it in Fallout, really.
Yeah, no, well, and that's, I don't disagree with that. Like, what I love about Fallout is that it answers the questions regarding that ambiguity, because, again, my issue with Rogue Nation isn't itself Ethan and Ilsa. Like, if that's the direction that they wanted to take this franchise, fine, but how does that relate to what we know about Ethan already? There was ambiguity there that Rogue Nation did not care to delve into. It just left that provocative ambiguity out there.
Maybe that's our disparity, because I think by the time the end credits rolled for Rogue Nation, my thought was, okay, that answers that question. There's no sexual tension. They just trust each other. It's not there. It answers that. It's gone.
I did not feel that at all. I did not feel any closure there.
I felt closure there, which is maybe why I sensed some awkwardness in those final minutes between the two of them in Fallout. I don't think it quite earned that yet, and maybe Dead Reckoning will give me more of that for me to go back to that and say, okay, now I see what they were doing. Yeah. Now I'm on the same wavelength here. Yeah,
once Julia is brought into Fallout, and in an instant you see Ethan change drastically, vividly, palpably, bitterly. He changes, and his motives completely switch gears, and it becomes all about her at that time. And to me, I find
her being Julia, right?
Yes. And the depiction of that, I think, is powerful. One, Tom Cruise, his performance is great. But the choice to do that instantaneously answers every question I had about Rogue Nation and where this franchise was going to go. And I do love that it's the same director that is doing both of those movies, because if it was a different director doing Fallout, then it could have been like a little bit of a retcon, like a little bit of Last Jedi going on here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it doesn't quite get there.
Like
it almost becomes a retcon the second they start caressing each other, Ilsa and Ethan. It starts to feel like a retcon to me a little.
Well, see, the reason I don't feel any tension between them and Fallout has nothing to do with them and how they interact at the end of that movie or throughout it. To me, it has everything to do with his choices toward Julia. Everything to do with his choices toward, like, to me, that answered everything I needed to know about Ethan, where he stands, and who he was, even as it relates to Rogue Nation and the events of that film. Which didn't answer. But McQuarrie, who directed Rogue Nation in Fallout, told us this is where Ethan is. His relationships, what he cares about, what he chooses to protect, this is it. The same guy making that choice. So to me, I think he is implying, regardless of how you feel about the provocative nature of Rogue Nation, it doesn't matter. This is who Ethan is. This is what he cares about. And when Julia's brought in, you see it very
when
vividly.
Julia, when Julia's brought in, that's that reminder of who he's trying to protect in the first place. All right, and that's what his ethos is, like what he's fighting for. I guess my thing is, by the end, like, is Fallout suggesting that he is now in love with Ilsa Faust?
I don't think so.
I think it is. That's my problem with it. I think those moments at the end are. Like, they might as well just full on started making out at the end of Fallout.
I did not sense that at all.
That is all I sense in those moments.
I will say this: if you are correct, and that's what McQuarrie was going for, I don't even have to think about it. It's my least favorite of these movies, instantaneously.
See, maybe that's our thing. It's like I feel like that's what we're kind of dancing around, trying to arrive at this moment here that we're sort of vaguely describing. I feel like Fallout was suggesting that we are now introducing a new romantic interest for Ethan Hunt in those final minutes.
See, now, I don't think that's the case. And to me, that makes no sense whatsoever, given his reaction toward Julia and what takes place there. Like, the emotion of it is palpable. It's great. The performances are wonderful. I love it. To undermine that with what you're suggesting is obtuse to a degree I can't even begin to articulate.
Well, and we'll see what Dead Reckoning suggests, because I feel like literally the final 30 seconds of Fallout, I think already started to do that.
If I will say this, like, I'd never felt that. And I've seen the film multiple times. I do not, like, this is the first I've heard of anyone even talking about it in that way.
Yeah.
I will say this, though.
Okay.
If Dead Reckoning wants to go in that direction and they earn it, if they build toward it, it's not instantaneous, I'm open to the idea, but it has to be some sort of, here's what happened in Fallout, this is where I stood, and now I can move in this direction. If they build their way there, I'm not opposed to it, but I don't want it to be what you're suggesting, where it's instantaneous. We've already laid the groundwork, so we can just go head on into them being in a relationship. Like, if that's what it is immediately, then Dead Reckoning we're going to have some issues.
We're going to have some issues, man. If it does do that, we're going to have a fun conversation on that movie. But I don't want to speculate. You know, I don't want us to speculate, because if it does go in that direction, I want to see what it still does with it, and we don't go in with these preconceived notions and find ourselves frustrated way too soon. Yeah,
because I will say, like, that was never my interpretation of Fallout. Never.
Well, I like hearing that, because it makes me want to rethink those final minutes. It's something I sensed in those final minutes that I didn't really care for, because I don't think it quite earned the romanticism of that just yet.
Well, and that's why, like, I never felt any sort of romantic tension. And maybe this is a little bit of hindsight, knowing what happens to Ethan in Fallout, but even throughout that film, like throughout the first half of the film, and I certainly noticed this more on a rewatch, that, you know, Ilsa is brought in because, you know, her mission is very myopic. I say that in a good thing. Like, it's very, this is what it is. Blinders on, and Ethan is somewhat in the way of that, but because of their history together, they're sort of in the way, but also sort of working together. Like, it's this interesting kind of flipping of the coin.
Right.
And then, given everything that plays out at the end, to me, the tender, I guess, warmth that is felt amongst all of the characters, I think, is a simple result of the emotional fallout, pun intended. And to me, that's all that it reminded. Like, to me, it's like, okay, like, anyone that is vulnerable in that situation as Ethan is, like, the people around you are going to be aware of that, and they'll be very warm towards you. So like, to me, it's a circumstantial thing. And given the circumstances, it makes sense that a character would react in that way. And so to me, that's always been my interpretation of it. I've never felt it anything outside of that, the emotion that Fallout is going for.
Well, I hope it sticks to that. And that's where Dead Reckoning will get really interesting to see what it's trying to tell us. Because I did not quite get that vibe. I felt like it was moving in a different direction, sexually and romantically, that I was just not feeling. I was not feeling. But, you know, we'll see where this goes. We'll see where this goes. I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying I still really like Fallout. I still think it's a very good film in this franchise. Still number 3 for me of these 6 thus far. Yeah. We haven't even really talked about Mission Impossible 2 yet.
That was gonna be the next thing I brought up. Like, how do we feel about 2?
I mean, okay, it's the worst film in the franchise. Is it my least favorite? I don't know. And it's because it was my favorite movie when I was 11. Okay, like fair enough. It's a product of its time, but I'm always gonna have a nostalgic connection to what John Woo was doing for that movie, which doesn't necessarily hold up, but I kind of like that it doesn't. I'll never get bored of that movie. I'll never get bored of it. It's a weird thing to say, but I do kind of have a soft spot for Mission Impossible 2, and I mean, the soundtrack, the theme song is done by Limp Bizkit, for crying out loud. I mean, that's the kind of movie we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
I kind of like it. I don't know. I will say this, looking at it more critically, I do think there are some good things in it. I like the chemistry a lot between Tom Cruise and Tandy Newton. I think as far as it being the sexiest film of the franchise, I think it certainly earns that title. And I do like their camaraderie together on screen. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to seeing Tandy Newton return to this franchise, if I'm being honest, because there's been we've seen continuity with all these films except for Mission Impossible 2. That's really the only one we haven't really seen any real callbacks for yet, right? I wouldn't be opposed to bringing some attention back to that one, and I would love it to be in the form of Tandy Newton, because I think that they had some good chemistry there at least. Yeah,
I did like her as well, and love their chemistry, and I do love the late 90s. I know this came out in 2000, but it certainly has that.
Oh, it was at that transition point. Yeah. Like you look at movies and pop culture from the early 90s, right? It still has an 80s kind of aesthetic to it. It hadn't quite make the full transition yet. And I think the same can be said about Mission Impossible 2. Just existing in a new decade, but still carrying the DNA of the 90s at least a little bit. Yeah.
Gotta love the slow-mo. And
okay, there's too much slow-mo in the movie. That is a critique I do have of the
movie. which is fair. It is over the top. I do love its absurdity. It is really fun in that regard. And, Tom Cruise is being Tom Cruise. There is certainly joy to be had. I do think it is by far the messiest of them, and by far the least its craft just isn't there for me. Comparatively, but I don't hate it. I think it's fine. It's a fine movie, I guess.
It's a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd for me. Like I still give it a passing grade, but again, chalk that up to nostalgia blinders, I guess. This literally was my favorite movie when I was 11 years old. I'm not even kidding.
Okay,
so I'm always gonna have a soft spot for it.
That's perfectly fair. You gotta love when we're bringing childhood into this. So
yeah.
Speaking of, when we did rewatch this, I did watch it with Sam, and he liked it.
Oh,
so it worked for a 3-year-old.
So he liked this one, Mission Impossible 2, right?
Yeah, he did like that one.
Has he seen them all, or at least some of them?
No. I think he's only seen 2 of them, I think.
Okay.
So I think he saw this one and Ghost Protocol, if I remember right. But
okay. Weirdly, I think maybe the 2 that are most appropriate for a young mind, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. We haven't really talked much about the first film all that much, Brian De Palma's film.
And we can talk about De Palma.
We can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good transition, because normally when you want to introduce even a young mind to this franchise, you want to go in order, but I don't know. That first film has a brutality to it, right? I mean, it's very much a Brian De Palma film, and that's something I respect about the franchise in general, right? Is that each director has brought their own stamp to each film. Even Christopher McQuarrie, who has directed 2 films thus far. I mean, 3 films. We haven't seen Dead Reckoning yet, but Rogue Nation and Fallout almost feel like they came from different minds, right? Like he tried to change himself throughout that, which I kind of appreciate. But each director brings their own flair, and Brian De Palma makes a Brian De Palma film that just happened to kickstart a major franchise like this. And I think it's really good. Like, I think it's actually one of Brian De Palma's better films. It's a very efficient and tight thriller, a very different kind of film that this franchise would eventually become, but has one of the best set pieces of the franchise, the Langley heist.
Of course.
I think is quite
incredible.
Iconic
at this point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's one of the best heists in all of movies, if you ask me.
Sure.
It's certainly one that could be in the conversation at least. And even some of the sequences that look kind of dated, like the final train fight, the chase at the end of the film.
Yeah.
There's something about it that still holds up for me. Like it might be the sound of it and the way it's all edited and constructed that just has a brutality to it. Like, it's one of the more brutal films in the franchise for me. And the tactility of it, I think, is really good too.
No, I agree. I kind of love the dolefulness of it at times. It's my favorite of them, aesthetically speaking. Like from a craft direction perspective, I think it is my favorite of them. Even though, as we noted earlier, like as the franchise goes, especially with Ghost Protocol and Ghost Protocol onward, these movies, always up the ante in terms of stunt work and, action spectacle. And that first Mission Impossible doesn't have the spectacle as the later films would, but in terms of direction, using the camera, editing, pacing, I think that first film is just crackling in all of those areas. Like what De Palma does with the camera in this film is just absurd. It is so good. It is incredible. Like so much, like just from a visual perspective, and again, going back to how, the medium of film is its visuals, but it's also its characters. And this film has all of it. Like, even though we don't get to know Ethan as we would in later films, he's still a very mesmerizing presence in this film. He's got this allure to him that's fantastic. The supporting characters, I think, are great. Just the espionage, the tenseness of that film, I just think is absolutely incredible. And then you couple that with De Palma's filmmaking and how he's using the camera here. And
Dutch angles, baby.
You gotta love it. It's a great film to look at. It's one that you feel in a different way than something like 3 and some of these others that we've been talking about, but you certainly feel it, and it is palpable. So I do love how vivid the film is. It's very astute in its filmmaking and in its character progression and the reveals, like the twists and turns, they all come at the right time and they're all extremely gratifying. It's just a really sharply made movie.
The sharpness of it, I think, is a great way to describe it. And you were talking about this with Mission Impossible 3 and how maybe the unsung hero of that film is the screenplay. Many of these films have actually really good screenplays. I would argue Mission Impossible 2 and Ghost Protocol are the ones that leave the most to be desired from a writing standpoint.
Yes, I agree.
But I think all of the others are very cleverly written in their own way, but I love the first film here from Brian De Palma because I think the script is maybe the trickiest of them all. I think if I recall, the film was sort of criticized for being a little bit convoluted and hard to understand at the time when it came out in 1996, and I can understand why that is, because many spy thrillers weren't really that tricky at that time. It was sort of a oncoming trend that in many ways I feel like this film almost like foresaw. But I think the script here from David Koepp and Robert Towne is very tricky in getting the audience to pay attention to little things because it uses dramatic irony in a really interesting way. One of my favorite examples of the entire franchise and how it does this is, we're in spoilers. I mean, we could talk about these films now, I feel like.
Sure.
It's the reveal that Jon Voight's character is not dead. And he shows up at and surprises Ethan, and they have this conversation where Jon Voight says, "It was Kittredge who shot me." And Ethan says something like, "Oh, yeah, Kittredge is the mole. He's the one I'm supposed to be looking out for."
Yeah.
And then Ethan has this vision of how everything played out, but it's not at all what he's telling Job or Jon Voight's character. Mm-hmm. It's cueing us in that Ethan's actually a step ahead of the real bad guy, and he's telling us that without telling the actual bad guy. So it's really, really clever. I love that. It's a really good use of kind of surprising us before the surprise twist or the villain reveal even comes. So when the villain reveal comes, we already know about it.
Yeah.
Because Ethan told us directly. I think that's really clever writing there.
Yeah, I think that's really great, to your point, in terms of the film's cleverness and how it toys with the audience throughout the film. I think that begins with the opening of the film, right? Where you cast actors that we know and recognize only for them to be killed off in the first 10 minutes of the film.
Yeah.
And so it's
in
like
pretty brutal ways. Like as brief as that sequence is of Emilio Estevez's death.
Yeah.
Like you freeze frame that. That's pretty tough to watch.
It is. It is. And it's interesting that they're willing to bring on Emilio Estevez someone that you recognize, and you don't necessarily anticipate that he's going to die in the first 5 minutes, but that's what happens. So like immediately, you know that you're in, like, everything you see, you can't trust. And the film continues that motif throughout. So when that moment you're talking about comes near the end, it is one of those things where you don't know what to expect, what's around the corner, what's to your left. Like, everything is kind of out in the open. Yeah. And I do love that from just an audience experience perspective. Like, again, the sharpness of the storytelling, the direction, everything behind it. Like, it's just so well done. So, like, you know, it certainly goes to show that, like, the spectacle doesn't have to define this franchise. Like, you know, I'm sure Dead Reckoning will get to that. We know that they're doing the jump. You know, there's a train fight, I think, at some point.
Yeah, there's a train chase, from what I understand. There's probably another motorcycle chase at some point. I feel like they have to be in every one of these movies now.
Absolutely.
So we know we're getting that. You're right.
Absolutely. And look, I'm not saying don't do spectacle. You know, even that first Mission Impossible had its, you know, action sequences, but you don't have to completely up the ante to the point where you're having a car chase in space. Like, you don't have to do that.
Well, that's something I thought about, because when we first saw Fallout, and while it isn't my favorite in the franchise, it is perhaps the most unique in terms of what it brought from a spectacle standpoint, right? Like, the way it just kept upping the ante. I thought, what are they going to do to one-up this and make it unique going forward? And I'm sure Dead Reckoning finds something to do, right? But what if we got one of these films in the future, maybe directed by Christopher McQuarrie once again, that doesn't have the spectacle, that does something completely different? Or what if it does maybe one continuous 2-hour action sequence that's just fully choreographed? And, like, there are things you can do that are unique and different, but I guess the point is, what if we do get one in the future that doesn't have that spectacle? Like, I think that would be an interesting subversion, honestly.
I completely agree. I think having, you know, whether it's McQuarrie or someone else, like, I think mimicking, echoing something like a De Palma, you know, or, again, I'm not saying it has to be in the vein of a J.J. Abrams. I'm not talking about his direction, but we talked earlier about how Mission Impossible 3 is just, it's so much smaller in scale because it's grounded in its emotion. Like, you could simply go back to, like, that idea. You can bring in a filmmaker that's better than J.J. Abrams. That's perfectly fine. But the idea of making it more smaller and grounded again, you know, like, I'm not opposed to that either. So, like, I mean,
I'm with you.
It doesn't have to be like a Fast and Furious thing. As much as I have loved the spectacle, in fact, one of the best things about this franchise, and we haven't even mentioned this yet, but everyone listening, watching to this, remembers when the news broke that Tom Cruise had strapped himself to the outside of an airplane. You're like, what? He did what? He strapped himself to the outside of an airplane. That is insane. That is utterly insane. And, you know, and there's photos, there was videos going around on the internet of him strapped to the outside of a plane at 10,000 feet. And you're like, what
it was the money shot. It was the money shot of the first trailer.
Of the trailer. Yeah. And you see him go up and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Insane.
And of course, what I love about that film too, and I think you and I agree with this at least, it gets it right out of the way. It's the first thing that happens.
Yeah. So it has nothing to do with really that film at all. It's just the cold open, which makes it all the better. So I love that about this franchise. And I'm not saying it has to go away, but to that point, you could do something as a cold open and the rest of it can simply be a more grounded experience. Or
I would love to see a Mission Impossible film that has a cold open like that as the moment of subversion, right? And then the rest of the movie is, let's say, imagine something like the Langley heist for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm not opposed
I'm not
to
saying
it.
I'm not saying the franchise needs to do that. But
man,
that would take it won't, and we know that. But I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to something that surprising.
No, I completely agree. So
yeah,
you know, it's gonna be interesting to see what they do moving forward. But
Yeah.
I've liked all of these films to one degree or another. I will continue to champion Mission Impossible 3. I love its writing. I love its emotional motives. And Tom Cruise, he goes for it. His performance is so good.
I will say, I think from a dramatic standpoint, it is his best performance, emotionally speaking. Is Mission Impossible 3 your favorite film directed by J.J. Abrams? Because I know you also love The Force Awakens quite a bit.
Yeah. Again, I'm just going to embrace my how weird I am, I guess. Because the thing is, like, I'm not necessarily like, yes, J.J. Abrams is one of my favorite filmmakers, pro J.J.
No, but he's made at least 2 films in 2 different franchises that you've loved, that you thought were some of the best moments of those respective franchises.
Yeah, and to me, in both cases, it's for the same reasons. It's for one, how subversive they are, especially within the mythologies of their own franchises, and it's less on his filmmaking. Like it's less of that, and it's more so how he taps into emotion and character. That's what I love about The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens, does it have the magic of what we saw in the original trilogy or what Rian Johnson would bring in The Last Jedi? Maybe not. But what I love about The Force Awakens is that it takes the mythos of Star Wars and completely flips it on its head. So instead we have a protagonist that knows nothing, but she's heard stories. She's heard these fascinating stories from legend and lore that's been passed down over there used to be these Jedi things, and they used to do these mind tricks. Like, she knows about it. It's all legend. And then there's Ben, who wants to be Darth Vader. He has the mask. He has the confidence. Like, he thinks that he's Darth Vader, but underneath he's a child. And he doesn't have the maturity. He's not Darth Vader. If anything, it's the opposite. So JJ takes what we know about Star Wars and then completely reverts it. Completely gives us the opposite effect. And so then it becomes this movie about myth and about, subverting myth. And that's what I love about that movie. So, like, again, it's how he uses character, how he uses emotion, and then you get into the whole Han Solo of it all. That's another thing, right? Han Solo in The Force Awakens is not the scoundrel that we love from the original trilogy. And that movie, he's a father desperate to get his son back. That's who he is.
I love that stuff. It's no coincidence that J.J. Abrams' best films are the ones that are like introducing something new within a franchise that we already know about, right? I wouldn't be surprised if we agree with this. Maybe the order might change, but I think J.J. Abrams' 3 best movies are The Force Awakens, Mission Impossible 3, and that first Star Trek. And as far as I'm concerned, they're the only 3 I really like from him. Because when he tries to crystallize on some of those ideas, I don't think he's able to quite get there. But I think these 3 films are examples of ones where he brings a new energy to some of these great stories, and at least introduces some new trajectory for them. And now Mission Impossible 3 is not an introduction of the franchise, but it is in some ways
different turn, though.
But it is at least an introduction to the person of Ethan, right? So in some ways, it is kind of kickstarting something within the Mission Impossible franchise, right? And J.J. Abrams has always been really good at doing that.
Yeah, and again, say what you will about Star Trek, but the interesting thing about that film is that he's able to, and I know he makes it Star Warsy, but it's
still a very fun movie.
It's really fun, and I think he does a great job of bringing in an audience that otherwise wouldn't be there, because I didn't grow up watching Star Trek, and if not for that kind of appeal that he brings to that movie, I don't know if I would have liked it as much as I did. Now, should he have continued on with that franchise? Maybe not. You could argue the same thing with Star Wars as well, although that last film is that's a Disney disaster, not a JJ.
That's
disaster.
not a JJ. I mean, JJ Abrams is sadly tied to that because his name is tied to it. So I think by by association alone, we have to call that a J.J. Abrams movie, and it is my least favorite J.J. Abrams movie. But I realize it's not necessarily his fault. So he's guilty by association at that point.
But yeah, to your point, like in terms of like starting franchises in a new place, I think he does a really great job of that. And so for the same reasons I mentioned with The Force Awakens, and obviously I noted it earlier, like I just love Ethan's progression throughout 3 and how beautifully human it is. And that's something that we hadn't really seen yet in that franchise. And I still don't know if we've gone quite to those levels yet in the latter films, but I have enjoyed them though. As you know, Rogue Nation, I do really like, especially in hindsight of Fallout, and Fallout to me that's probably my number 2. Gotcha. I do love that movie a lot. So. Yeah,
so I guess to round this out, so you have Mission Impossible 3 at number 1, then you have
then I have
Fallout at number 2, and then Mission Impossible 1 at number 3.
Yes.
Rogue Nation at number 4, I guess, and then Ghost Protocol at number 5, and then Mission Impossible 2 in last place.
Yes, that'd be correct.
All right. Yeah, because right now I think I have Rogue Nation at number 1, Mission Impossible 1 at number 2, Fallout number 3, Ghost Protocol number 4, and then 5 and 6 are kind of interchangeable. I mean, factually speaking, it's Mission Impossible 3 and then Mission Impossible 2, but some days I'll reverse those two for 5 and 6, just given my nostalgic love for Mission Impossible 2. But again, there are no bad films in this franchise, if you ask me. I enjoy I can rewatch all of them all the time. Yeah, I never get sick of them in that way.
Absolutely. And like I've watched quite a few of them in the last few weeks prepping for Dead Reckoning. Earlier today, I revisited Mission Impossible 3, and perhaps that's part of why I came into this so passionate.
I was gonna say you have a fuel for that passion right now, as if you did some very recent homework.
I just watched it, and I'm like, man, the dialogue and the writing here is so goddamn incredible. Like it just does not get the credit it deserves. It is really. I don't care what you think of J.J. Abrams. His direction could be bad. Fine, we can have that argument. I don't hate it, but if you do, fine. I will absolutely die on the hill, though. The screenplay is electric. It is really great.
Good. Yeah,
the performances are phenomenal. So, like again, where that film lacks in visual invitingness, it more than makes up for that in performance and in theme, and especially in emotion. Like it just crackles in those areas. And some of these others we've talked about, it's a little bit of the opposite. So, like, I guess it just depends on kind of what all of those things do for you from film to film, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, it just kind of depends.
It's what you look for. It's what you look for in these films. Yeah.
Yeah. If the visuals appeal more to you, then sure, I get Rogue Nation and Fallout a little bit more. Or even Ghost Protocol in that way. But, you know, some of the writing is a little lesser for me. And that's all this really kind of comes down to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. But nonetheless, good franchise.
Good franchise. Should we get to this week's poll?
Let's do so.
It's real bad, okay? I don't like those numbers at all.
Just one poll? Those things aren't scientific.
Yes, they are. All this is science. This is math.
Let's keep the Mission Impossible theme rolling, right? We asked everyone, what's the best Mission Impossible action sequence of the franchise? Stunt, action sequence, whatever it is. I mean, I was trying to list out a lot of options here, JD, and it got to a point where I thought I was writing a book. But I think we did a pretty good job covering our bases here, because we still had a write-in option here, and it didn't get utilized. You know, I think we threw out all the options that needed to be included here. I don't think it's a real surprise, the option that ends up winning this poll, though we alluded to it during our conversation here on this episode, JD, that the literal centerpiece of this franchise, the transitional action sequence of sorts, is the climbing of the Burj Khalifa in Ghost Protocol. In many ways, it kind of redefined the franchise going forward. That is number one, like not even close. That ends up winning at almost 41% here. But we did get a 3-way tie for second place, all at 12.5%. That included 2 from Fallout, the helicopter chase and the bathroom fight.
Okay. Yeah,
and
I understand.
We also have 1 from Rogue Nation. That's the Opera House sequence.
Okay. That'd be the one, I guess. Yep.
Yep. Which honestly, from an action film standpoint, that might be my favorite sequence of the entire franchise. And I think it's just the musical choreography of it. The fact that it almost feels like a ballet. And that's something that I think Rogue Nation does really well, is that it almost feels like an action musical of sorts. The way it's all there's almost like a dance to it, right? And that's with every sequence in the movie. So in some ways, I feel like the opera house scene is almost symbolic of what that film is doing as an action film. But I think it's really great. In third place there at 9%, just over 9%, was the Langley heist from the first Mission Impossible film there. But we did get a vote here and there for the Halo jump in Fallout, the motorcycle chase from Fallout, the mountain climb from Mission Impossible 2, as well as the bridge attack from Mission Impossible 3.
Okay, there you go.
I will say, like, there are a few surprises here, JD, and maybe we didn't have this poll out long enough to get more votes to maybe make it a bit more competitive, but I would have expected to see at least a few votes here for the plane hang from Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, and maybe even a few bits of love here for the maybe the motorcycle chase from Rogue Nation as well. But needless to say, I'm not too surprised by these specific ones that won the poll.
Yeah, I'm not too surprised either. I was a little worried there for a moment because it felt like recency bias was about to take shape, because I wasn't sure if we were going to get to the Langley heist, and then I think you said it came in third there. So
it did, yeah.
I was a little uncertain there for a moment, but we finally got there.
We did.
Although I think there's an argument to be made that's still the best. Maybe that would get my vote here. I think there's an argument to be made there. I will say, though, in hindsight, two that come to mind for me, especially off the heels of this conversation, might be the plane moment in Rogue Nation, simply because it's so insane.
It's so insane and also so futile.
And so futile, absolutely. The fact that it's just the cold open, there's something about that just makes it all the more appealing to me.
Sure. Yeah,
and like I get it, the Burj Khalifa incredible moment, but there is something about hanging. I just can't wrap my mind. Like, he strapped himself to the outside of an aircraft.
I know.
Flew 10,000. Like, that is not smart, but incredible to watch. And then the other one, and this is more thematic than anything, on and I don't think you listed it here on as part of the options, but I understand it. But like on a rewatch of 3, that opening action sequence when they're trying to get back what's her face? I keep forgetting Carrie Russell's character.
Carrie Russell's character, but I'm blanking on her name as well. Forgive us, listeners.
But at any rate, when they try to save her and fail,
Lindsay Ferris, that's the character name.
When they try to save Lindsay, there's immediacy to the reaction and Ethan, and with how he changes or how he views Julia, and again, what I love about the performance of it too, because Ethan gets back to the house and Julia asks him, "How did your trip go?" And the camera simply lingers on Tom Cruise for what feels like an eternity. It's probably a good 5 seconds. And Ethan doesn't say a word. He just stares at Julia and says everything you need to know about him in that moment without him uttering a single word.
It's a good scene.
So good. Yeah. And the very next moment later, they're having a conversation while they're away from the house. And she's like, what is this? Is this for real? Is this love for real? And again, the camera just lingers on Cruise's hesitancy. And it is incredible. And both of those are poignant because of the failure of that mission. There is a direct connective tissue between the two.
Yeah, you're right.
So to me, like that I think that just and it's a nicely well choreographed action sequence on its own, but the emotional connection of it.
Yeah.
You make a good point impeccably.
You make a good point that it's not just about the stunt work, right, or the spectacle of it, but it's how it's able to edit the moments of contemplation in the middle of all that. And I think that sequence does that pretty well. It actually has the right pauses at the right moment for those moments you're talking about there.
And Lindsay's death, credit to Kerry Russell here.
Yeah.
It echoes that dolefulness of the first Mission Impossible. Like, it's kind of a harrowing visual when
it's kind of a jump scare in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. It's incredible. So in hindsight, that one is actually quite high for me now.
Yeah, maybe I should have included it on the list. It might not have gotten any votes, but I know
I don't think it would have. And, because people don't really think about it in those terms. It's him. Look, he's high on that building, or he's on the outside of a plane. And look, I get it. The spectacle of those, in many ways, makes sense. But
in many ways, we were asking that for this week's poll because it was also meant to tie into our original topic of action sequences of the 21st century. We just happened to reverse course on this given time. But you're not wrong. I think that argument for why that action sequence you really love there, it makes sense, and it's just a very different type of argument that we normally wouldn't see for something like this. But it makes sense for what it's doing.
Right. I'm just trying to say there's more than one way to shoot an action sequence.
More than meets the eye.
Yeah. More than one way for it to be interpreted. So
yeah, absolutely.
At any rate, thanks for everyone that voted on the poll. Really do appreciate it. Can't say the results are all too surprising, but I do understand it. That is for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, as we wind down here, a thank you to all of our patrons. As we wind down here, thank you to all of our patrons. Really can't do this without you. Your support goes a long way. That's patreon.com/InSessionFilm. As far as next week on the show, have no idea.
Well, I don't think we have an idea yet, JD. This is to be determined because normally, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning hasn't come out yet. It comes out Wednesday, right? So in order to be top of mind with this, we're actually being a bit early with this topic of this particular episode. Normally, this episode would probably be well-timed with whatever the weekend release is, but we're not quite doing that. And looking ahead, the weekend coming up looks kind of bare. We might be able to just kind of pick any topic that we want to talk about and just make a full episode about it. So we'll talk offline and figure out what we want to do there.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We have to figure out some logistics too because I'm going on vacation here very soon, but we'll have something figured out. So be on the lookout for that. We have a review for Joyride that will probably be up by the time this episode goes live. So you can go and check that out. No women in session this week, but they will be back very soon. I will say though, I will tease this. Ryan McQuaid might be coming back. We're trying to work out how this is going to work, but we've talked about this behind the scenes. He might be back in a really fun way.
I think I know what you're talking about. I don't think you should until we know for sure because
I'll wait.
If something happens and it doesn't end up going through, we don't want to make a false promise there.
Fair.
Because I think what you're talking about and what we're potentially promising is something a lot of people are going to want to hear.
Yeah, people will be interested. It's going to be something we've never done before as well.
Yes.
So keep that in mind, but it's going to be really great. I hope that we can figure out the timing of it and that we can make it work, but be on the lookout for that. That's all I'll say. Be on the lookout for that. Yeah. It's going to be really, really fun. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube. Subscribe, hit that like button on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We would love your subscriptions there. You can follow us on social media and now Blue Sky and Threads and God knows what else that we'll get in the next week.
I'm lost.
Or you could just email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Let us know how much you enjoy the show. Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Where is the IMF team to help us navigate social media? That is the mission right there. If they choose to accept it. I don't think they will.
I don't know either. I was joking with Dave Giannini earlier this week, though, because we were talking about, we got to get on Threads, and then, we were on Blue Sky, in addition to everything else. And I was like, we need someone to run all this, because it's overwhelming to me. Like, I just can't do it anymore.
I mean, and it's not just about what does what. It's also about what makes sense for our kind of platform, because some of them might not. That's the thing, and that understanding needs to be there.
Well, the interesting thing about Blue Sky and Threads is simply an imitation of Twitter.
That's absolutely
all that it is.
Yeah.
And honestly, they are lesser forms of Twitter. Twitter is still the king. It is still the best. However, it might not exist soon. Who knows? Like the volatility of Twitter.
It might be the best, but it's not always the best to be there right now.
Exactly. And it might die at any moment. So, like, what's the alternative? Is it going to be Blue Sky? Maybe not, because right now they're still in a beta phase, and you have to have a code to get on there.
Yeah.
Or there's Threads.
We at least need to make sure we're there and we're transitioning our listeners to those platforms in the process, so that way the work is more or less done. Trying to get ahead of the game.
And most of film Twitter has been on Threads, and a lot of them are on Blue Sky too. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a work in progress. Who knows? Maybe Twitter will still be the place to be. I don't know.
And maybe Threads will get better by simply copying everything that Twitter does.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, you never know. It is Facebook after all, or Meta.
It's
however
Meta.
You want to.
Yeah.
I'll just say I'm dubious about.
I'm dubious
Threads,
as well.
but-
Yeah. I don't know, but it might be fun while it lasts. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a fun engagement thing. I don't know how I feel about Facebook and Meta in terms of their policies. I'll just say it that way.
Yeah, we'll keep that vague.
At any rate, social media has become weird. But we're on all of it. At InSession Film, just find us there. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at InSession Film there as well. Hopefully you all enjoyed Dead Reckoning. Let me know how much you hate me for my Mission Impossible 3 thoughts. I am not sorry, but I will gladly
Don't
hear
be sorry.
you yell at me anyway.
Stand your ground, my friend.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Love MI3. It's the best.
Bum, 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 bum.
We made USAA insurance to help you save. Take advantage of discounts when you cover your home and your ride. Discover how we're helping members save at USAA.com/bundle. USAA. Restrictions apply.